Hi Rob, thanks for joining us on the Hart Square podcast today. It's great to have you join myself and Rob to talk about all things cybersecurity. But before we get started and into this big topic, it'd be great if you could give us a bit of an introduction into yourself, your role, and a bit about ramsac as well, please.
Thanks, Ellie. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So I'm Rob May, and I'm the founder and managing director of ramsac, and we're a cybersecurity and IT services business founded 32 years ago. So we've been doing this a very long time, and cyber is really one of my passions, and I wear a number of different cyber hats. Actually, I'm the UK ambassador for cybersecurity with the IOD, and I sit on the advisory board of the Cyber Resilience Centre, which is a joint venture between the cyber industry, academia and law enforcement, and we bring those three different elements together. And then I do an awful lot of speaking around the world on this very subject, on cybersecurity, on cyber resilience, to audiences of all sizes. Sometimes it's 10 or 12 people, and my largest audience was 20,000 people. So I speak about this subject an awful lot, and I'm really passionate about it because it's such a big subject and it affects absolutely everybody, but there's so much that we can do to protect ourselves and our loved ones.
Thanks, Rob. That's a really good intro, and interesting as well, because one of the things that we were going to say about was, cybersecurity, is a hot topic. It feels like it's a hot topic at the moment, but even from your introduction, it's obvious that it's not new as such in that sense. But there is obviously a lot of narrative, a lot of conversations happening around it at the moment. So I'm almost kind of just test the question. So I was going to say, cyber attacks have become more commonplace. The non-profit sector in which we both work, it hasn't been immune to that by any stretch. I was going to pose the question of actually start by what do we mean by cyber attacks? But maybe I can double that up with what do we mean by cyber attacks? And do you think that they're more common now than you were seeing last year, the year before, even bearing in mind, the length and depth of your experience?
Yes, no, absolutely. So a cyber attack is where a individual or an organization maliciously try to exploit the vulnerabilities in someone's computer systems or their computer networks, or even the people within the organization, in order to cause them harm or get unauthorized access to information that they shouldn't have access to. That, in essence, is what a cyber attack is. And yes, definitely, we see, year on year, we see far more of this, and the definition of what is a cyber attack changes from year to year. It's not that long ago that if somebody wanted to get a lot of money, they would, put a stocking over their head and go into a bank. They don't do that anymore. They do it from behind their computer screen.
Yeah. And
yes, the numbers every year, the numbers increase.
It's interesting. I mean, even with that analogy, is it about is it easier to whether it's for financial gain or whatever the actual intention is? Because again, we could go off on motivation, couldn't we, around why people do this? But is it easier nowadays to attack somebody from a digital, with a cyber attack, than it was in kind of a more physical theft experience, like the ones you described, or is it just that the technology almost lends itself to that kind of behavior?
I think the technology lends itself. We live our lives online, don't we? And whether that's you sat behind your computer doing your job, or whether it's simply the fact that you're using a smartphone to send a message or make a purchase. I think the thing is, this technology is in all of our hands all of the time.
Mm.
And the cyber criminals have become very skilled at working out what they need to do to manipulate you. And that's part of the problem.
And is that ultimately what it's about? It is about finding a way to manipulate you to then achieve whatever your financial gain or whatever it is that you're setting out to do. Is that the kind of ultimate motivation for cyber criminals in that sense? And sorry, this kind of subsidiary then is, in what respect are non-profits most vulnerable, would you say?
I think one of the, firstly, if we talk about non-profits,
mm-hmm.
I don't think that just because you're a non-profit makes you any more of a target or any less of a target, and it certainly doesn't make you immune. We see two definite types of attack. One is targeted, and the cyber criminal, for whatever reason, has said, I am going to target this organization and I want to get inside this organization, or I want to disrupt this organization.
And sorry, Rob, that's a very specific, somebody hunting down a particular organization.
Absolutely that.
Okay.
So that would be a targeted attack. But equally, there are a great deal of untargeted attacks, what we call spray and pray, where the cyber criminal is literally just sending out hundreds of thousands of attempts attacking a vulnerability. Now, some vulnerabilities are known vulnerabilities. So, for example, there might be a flaw in a piece of software,
mm-hmm.
and it's documented and it does the rounds in the cyber world. And basically what they say, in essence, if you can find someone who's using this type of computer or this operating system or whatever it is, there's a door and we can get through that door. A number of years ago, I don't know whether you remember, a number of years ago, we had what the British press called the NHS cyber attack.
Mm-hmm.
75% of NHS trusts got shut down by a cyber attack and couldn't operate for a couple of days, in both senses of the word. It wasn't an NHS cyber attack. It was actually a cyber attack that came out of North Korea called WannaCry. Now, WannaCry was attacking a known vulnerability in Microsoft Windows at the time. Okay. The issue is, Microsoft knew about the vulnerability and they had fixed it, and they'd issued updates. Now, every single month on the second Tuesday of each month, we get Patch Tuesday. Now, Microsoft had fixed this known vulnerability, and every update that they'd sent out in Patch Tuesday for 3 years.
3 years
had fixed the problem. 75% of the NHS hadn't applied a single one of those free of charge Microsoft updates. And if they had, they wouldn't have been able to be attacked. So sometimes with not-for-profits, it's they're not spending the money upgrading and maintaining their systems. And that then makes them, that would mean that they have a bigger vulnerability.
Yes. Yeah, I get that. But it's interesting because it is that combination then of technology, the technology at its heart, but it's then the policies, the processes, and the people around it that contribute to either or to being more or less secure. Is that reasonable?
Oh, absolutely. And look, people's a massive part of this.
Yeah.
And it's equally as much of the puzzle as the technology and the policies and the good hygiene is.
So when we see things in the press or whatever it might be about kind of email-based scams, for want of a better word, where people are sending out, I mean, I don't know, it seems strange to me to think that people do still in any context, but in a work context, they'll click on these kind of random bizarre HTML attachments and and allow and open the door basically for the cybersecurity criminal. But is that actually what happens a significant amount of time? Is it really?
Absolutely, a massive amount of time.
Wow.
And there's a couple of things. So email attack is one of them. There's a talk that I do actually about the five vectors of social engineering. So the social engineering is the manipulation of somebody, the working of somebody to get them to do something. The five vectors are phishing, which is email based.
Yeah.
Vishing, which is voice solicitation. So this is where you get a phone call and they're pretending to be the bank or HMRC or whoever.
Yeah.
Smishing, which is phishing via a text message or an SMS message.
Okay, yeah, I've seen more of those recently.
Yeah, well, I read an article recently that's, in fact, it was from Which, and they said that in the UK, the average adult gets 9 smishing attacks a month.
Really?
And that will be, a missed Amazon delivery, supposedly, DVD, or there's one doing the rounds at the moment, which is the post office. And it says, we have a letter to deliver and there's 38 pence owing postage. Click here to pay the 38 pence. Yeah. That's a smishing attack and it's a scam. Crishing. So crishing is phishing via QR codes.
Seriously?
Yeah. And this is interesting because crishing didn't really exist prior to COVID.
Wow.
And then with COVID, everybody got really used to using QR codes. You use them to scan in to places or read menus or whatever. So if you scan a QR code with your phone, it is exactly the same as clicking on a link in an email. So cyber criminals are printing their own QR code stickers and sticking them in places that you might expect a QR code to be.
Yeah.
And then the final element is impersonation, which is physical. So if a cyber criminal is wanting to attack your organization, they can either try and break through whatever ID defenses you've got in place, or they can try and trick someone in the organization to do their dirty work for them.
Yeah.
Or the third option is they try and get inside the building themselves.
Physically inside, yeah. And
what they do is they look to see, well, who visits that organization, how regularly, how easy is it to get in, what's the process for checking in, and do you need a security lanyard and all of that stuff. And one of the scams, and everyone I've questioned on this, you see the penny drop, but one of the scams is they watch the building to find out what company do you use to service your sanitary waste bins. So think about it. So they then dress in the same uniform as that company and they walk into reception with 2 sanitary bins under their arms.
Yeah. You can see
the question is, what response do they get? Firstly, by reception, and often they'll get waved through. But the other more telling thing, I think, is if you talk to staff within an organization and you ask them, when did you last speak to the person that was servicing the sanitary waste bins? No one ever does. They are hidden in plain visibility. And they've got access to a building and they're walking around and they're looking for a unattended, unlocked computer that they can then stick an infected USB key in, for example, and they've got their cyber attack.
And that's what the physical attack is, because it's the cyber element, but the physical location enables them, like you say, to get some malware or whatever it might be, into the network. And
the thing with all of these, and it goes back to your initial question a moment ago about, do people really click on the links in the emails? The science of social engineering works on the basis that, I don't know whether you've ever read the book Chimp Paradox.
I haven't. No.
Chimp Paradox by Steve Peters is a really interesting book, and it uses a model to explain how our brains work. And in essence, what it says is we have 3 brains. We have a computer which stores data. We have a chimp brain, which is our animal brain that we're born with, and it's our animal instincts, and it's what keeps us alive. It's what controls our freeze, fight or flight responses.
Okay.
And then we have our human brain, and our human brain is our rational thinking human brain. And it develops, when you're born, you don't have that human brain. When you're born, you just have your chimp brain, and all that chimp's worried about is eating. Girls' chimp brains develop faster than boys' chimp brains, which is why girls tend to mature quicker when they're young. But your chimp brain, using this model, and it is a model, but the principle works. Your chimp brain makes about 90% of your decisions every single day.
Wow. And
your chimp brain is 5 times faster than your human brain. And it's looking at every input and it's saying, does this look right? Am I safe? Am I in danger? Does it taste right? Does it smell right? Does it feel right? All of those things. And if not, do I fight it, or do I leg it? Now, if it does match those, if it does feel right and it looks right and it's what I'm expecting and so on, actually, more often than not, your animal instincts respond.
Okay. And
your chimp brain just does stuff on autopilot. This is why we drive to work and we never remember the drive to work.
How do you forget here?
Because you weren't using your human brain. Your rational thinking brain wasn't engaged because you're on autopilot. It was when you were learning to drive. When you were learning to drive, you're thinking about everything.
Yeah.
But then you just go into autopilot. Now, social engineers, the cyber criminals, know that if they can plug enough pieces of the jigsaw, your chimp brain will look at it and think, I'm expecting that. It looks right. It feels safe. And you don't rationally think about it. And for everybody who has clicked on a link, especially anyone who's been trained, and we'll talk about cybersecurity training in a minute, but you still get people who have been trained or should know better who click on links. And that's because they're human. And actually, whilst they're human, they weren't using their human brain. They were just on autopilot.
Yeah. So everything felt right. So they just did it without thinking. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've heard of that chimp brain paradox, model before, but it's really interesting to see how that applies again in cybersecurity. You go on autopilot, it looks right, so you just fall into that trap. And definitely there's a lot of pillars that you call them, of different ways that cyber criminals kind of attack organizations. And I think you said earlier as well that the cyber attacks change year on year. You said about the QR codes only really coming into effect after COVID. So how can organizations really kind of keep up and support sort of cyber security in their organizations? Because as you say, it changes so often.
Yes, it does. And I think the thing is, we have to think about are we cyber resilient? And this is an ongoing discussion. So any project that any organization does should be considering cybersecurity. We talk about secure by design. It needs to be thought about. It's not a I've done cybersecurity tick box, because it continues to change. It's not a destination. It's a journey. But also, people do stuff. They will say, right, we need to respond to this, and we need to do something. But if you were to use an analogy of a house, if what you've done is you've changed the locks, you've upgraded the locks on the doors, or you've put bars on the windows, or you've put an alarm system in, or CCTV, that's great, so long as people use it. And also, the other thing that happens is often you get organizations who do all of those things, and they put lots of security things in place, but then they don't educate their staff. And metaphorically, what happens is somebody walks up to the door of this building that's got bars on the windows and the best locks in the world and all the rest of it, and they ring the doorbell, and someone opens the door and says, "Come on in." Yeah, that's what the clicking on the email, the link in the email is. So just because you're doing these things, it's got to also be part of the culture of the organization, and it needs to be ingrained in our thinking. When I'm doing training, I always say that if I'm going to train staff rather than the board or the trustees, I always start with, this is how you are being attacked every day in your home lives, in your social lives. This is what happens when you go to a coffee shop or to an airport or a bar or whatever. Because if you can make it part of their thinking in terms of, this isn't just a work thing, this isn't us as a non-profit having to do compliance. This is about how I'm being attacked, and about how my partner is being attacked, or my parents are being attacked. And we have to get that into people's mindset, I think.
Yeah, really interesting. So, and that is, like you say, I know you were talking about kind of the tech, but that's security by design. Be secure by design. Build it into the fabric of your behaviors. Build it into the culture of your organization. And is that something that you kind of mentioned there about training staff? Is it something where you educate boards and trustees at that kind of level as well, to kind of, it shouldn't, not purely top down, it's both ways around, isn't it? It's on the ground, but equally that cultural piece comes from the top, I guess.
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, there's a couple of things. You're absolutely right. The culture does come from the top, and therefore there's got to be the understanding. There's also a massive point that lots of people miss, and that's, we operate, certainly in the UK, we operate under the UK GDPR. In Europe, which is what came out of Brexit. Prior to that, we were, operating under GDPR. GDPR states all the regulations of what an organisation must do to look after the data for which it's responsible. And it also states what happens if you don't do that. It's the law that organisations are prosecuted under. And one of the things that I think a lot of organisations get wrong is, firstly, they think it's about marketing, and it's that misnomer that it's not really about, have I got the right to market to you? It's not. It's not about cookies. Well, not just about cookies. And incidentally, cookies should be called trackers, not cookies.
Yes. Yeah. Better
Again, changes people's perspective. Do you want to accept these trackers is a different question to, do you want to accept cookies?
Yes.
But the point that I was going to make is that it's the board and the trustees that have a legal responsibility for cybersecurity. Now, they might be very removed from the delivery of the security of any of the IT, but legally they have that responsibility, and that responsibility can't be outsourced. So it's really important that there is that understanding. and that it's not just about staff training, which is why actually I specified that staff training, in my opinion, is different. It's nuanced differently in terms of understanding where people's liabilities lie.
Yeah, and get them to understand the whole context. Like you say, it is actually about everyday life. It's not about like, okay, well, when I'm in work mode, I'm vulnerable, but the rest of the time I'm not.
Yes.
But yeah, interesting point about the GDPR data protection, because absolutely the same thing in many ways. You said yourself, it became, or it got presented in many organizations as, this is about whether or not we can send this email to these people. Yeah, where actually marketing was a very small part of it, and even the data protection was a part of it, but the policies and processes and regulations and requirement to train your staff on data protection regulations were fundamental actually to it being successful, and striving to do the same thing we're talking about, which is to embed that culture of, curate your data, look after your data, protect it, a lot better than we previously had.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that law continues to evolve. So
yeah,
and it continues to evolve again because the whole digital world continues to evolve. It's any of the standards around cyber. So Cyber Essentials, for example, which is an easy to access standards that the government brought in that's applicable to any organization, that keeps changing, and it keeps changing because our digital world keeps changing.
it has to.
COVID was a massive trigger. Most if not most, many organizations just didn't support work from home prior to COVID, and then they did, because it was forced upon them, and the genie's out of the bottle now. So but Cyber Essentials changed because of that. You're right, GDPR introduced mandatory cybersecurity training. In the last big update, which was end of December 21, that changed. And what they said at that point was that cybersecurity training must happen for all new members of staff within the first 30 days of starting employment, and before they're given access to any client or customer data.
Okay, interesting.
Lots of people have missed that.
No one even noticed. Yeah.
And it's interesting, actually. I haven't got evidence to this, but my theory on the 30-day thing is that we see so many cyber attacks on new members of staff.
Really? That's a specific. Okay.
Yeah, and cyber criminals will use LinkedIn as a tool to, someone moves and takes on a new position and they put it on LinkedIn. Yeah. And the cyber criminal goes, okay, there's someone new in the finance team.
Wow.
And they target, and one of the common attacks actually is they get a message supposedly from the chairperson or the CEO or whomever, asking them to go to a supermarket at lunchtime and buy gift cards, and to email the claim codes from those gift cards. I lost count how many organizations have told me they've fallen victim to that.
Really?
Totally. Now,
wow.
I always say, when we're doing our staff inductions, I always say, look, no director at Ramsac's ever going to ask you to buy cards. It's highly likely that you will get an email asking you to, because you just put your new position on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time.
And it is, but yeah, really interesting. And it's about getting into that mindset, isn't it, of being defensive, protective up front, I thought it was only recruiters who stalk people on LinkedIn like that. So that's news to me.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of that one more recently from someone I know who moved in roles into a new role, and they got that exact email. Luckily they knew that it was not to be clicked, but yeah, it's definitely quite sophisticated in lots of different ways, isn't it? Just sort of conscious of time and just, you know, we've covered loads already, and I know we could cover loads more, but as you say, it's changing, getting more sophisticated. It's something that will continue to change, but looking sort of focusing on this year in particular, is there any sort of particular areas you think organizations really need to focus on this year, or is it just kind of really all of those tips and the insights you shared throughout that you really need to kind of embed it into your culture and really think about it?
Yeah, I think partly it's what we've already talked about. You know, employee training is vital. Software updates, really important. You know, so again, so easy to the NHS attack was a software update thing. British Airways were attacked, and you know they got fined by the ICO. So the Information Commissioner's Office is who fines under GDPR. They got fined, and the reason they got fined was because there were 50 odd updates that hadn't been loaded to their software, or their you know, firmware updates or hardware software updates on their hardware. So these things are really important. And another thing that I say to people about this is, you know, the software world tries to keep us safe as well. So Microsoft, for example, switched from software updates being optional to pushing them out unless you physically turn that off, but by default they will push them out. One of the problems is something else that we saw as a result of COVID is that the world moved to laptops. You know, most people use laptops now rather than a desktop, and the problem with that is that lots of people don't turn their computers off. I'm guilty of this. You know, I finished work.
Sorry, don't turn it off.
Yes. So I finished work at the end of the day. I shut the lid on my laptop, put it in my bag, and leave. Now, whilst I'm getting updates pushed automatically to my laptop, some of them are useless until my computer's been restarted.
Restart.
And we can't force the laptop to restart. There are tools available that you can remind people, but for a lot of people, you are getting updates, but they're no good unless you restart your machine. So I always encourage people, create a habit. You know, for me, it's Friday evening. It gets to wine o'clock, and that's my prompt to turn the laptop off. Now it might go back on again shortly afterwards, but we've got to make sure that people are doing updates. Once a piece of software becomes unsupportable, i.e. it's outdated, that's then a big security risk. So again, you need to identify, is there anything that we're using as an organization that is no longer supported? You know, if you take Microsoft, for example, Microsoft will do security updates for 10 years. And then at the end of 10 years, they say, right, that's the end of the road for that. You've now really got to move off of that dated version of Windows. The same equivalent applies to other software and platforms that you're using, or indeed hardware. You know, you might be using a firewall or a router that can no longer get security updates. And you've got to identify those things. Make sure you're complying with GDPR. We talked about GDPR. And then I guess the other one that I've talked about quite a lot as a focus for 2023, but we've not mentioned it yet today, is being aware of your supply chain, being aware of who are you plugged into and who else is plugged into you. Because again, that's a path for cyber criminals. You know, if I know that you are a supplier to a much bigger organization And there's every chance that that much bigger organization has got a bigger budget and therefore going to be more cyber resilient. I might have a better chance of getting in through you. So think about your supply chain. It's not just about every machine that you're using.
Yeah. Which is the digital version of the guy who turns up in the uniform with the waste bin under his arm. Yeah. Interesting.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
So I think those are the main things. I mean, overall, people just need to stay vigilant and proactive in their approach to cybersecurity, because the threat will continue to grow, and we have to continue to implement security measures to protect ourselves, not just in 2023 but beyond that as well.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think that's a really great finishing point and one to end on and round up our podcast episode today. So I just want to, thank you again for taking the time to sit down and chat with us today. As I personally learned quite a lot in that. There's a lot of surprising things as well. And it just makes you really aware of it. So I'm sure our listeners will also take away some really great insights and practical tips as well. So really appreciate that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.